Good morning. I know what you're thinking. I just scrambled to sit down because I've been going over my notes because this is a complicated Sunday. So delighted to have you on board. Welcome as you begin to log on to this space. Obviously, this is going to be a crazy day. As I looked at my weather channel today on my cell phone, it literally said like 112 or something like that. So I know you're all hunkered down with your air conditioning on and you're figuring out how you're going to navigate this day. And so here's my contribution to your day. I'm going to give you enough to think about all day long. This story today that I'm going to try to do justice to is a story in Mark's gospel that is probably one of the more both eloquent and literarily, I'm just warming up, complicated stories in Mark's gospel, but it provides, for those of us who want to pay attention to it, this kind of like explosion of what it means to live into the way in which Jesus sees a community, real community, the beloved community, finding shape, being formed. So we got our hands full for this morning. Make sure you shout out to everybody and say hello. Obviously, as we've done week after week now in this digital universe, we try to create a sense of community. So popping up emoticons and screaming out to each other and maybe even telling us how you're doing so we can feel like we've checked in, sort of like what we do during coffee hour with each other. It just kind of makes it feel like home. And that's exactly where I'm at today, situated right here at home. And behind me is if you will, a story of my daughter and my son-in-law's farm back in Vermont when they first settled back there. And I have planted myself in the middle of this story. Because today we're going to explore a story in Mark's gospel, and Mark places in the middle of that story another story. And that's the image I wanted you to kind of hang on to today, that there is a story inside of the story. And that story really matters. See, I told you it's going to be quite a ride today. So welcome. Glad you're here. To get started today, as we often do, I want to provide just a simple centering piece. And that centering piece today is kind of motivated by the two candles I have lit today. So rather than a single candle, if you can scramble or even pause this if you're viewing it later and grab another candle, I want you to just take a moment to ground yourself and honor, a candle kind of standing in for the story that is your own, right? That you have a story that you're living into and through and are a part of. It is your amazing story, and I want that candle to be the way in which you honor your own story and all of its vibrancy and complexity, and to be grateful for the life that's unfolding within you. So I'm going to invite you to take a couple deep breaths and kind of honor, that which is the wonder of your own unfolding, mysterious, beautiful, complex, challenging, maybe, life. And at the same time, I want you to pay attention to another candle. For we all know that we do not live unto ourselves, right? That there are other stories unfolding around us and maybe even within us. Stories that we're not so familiar with, stories that are maybe even foreign to us. Those stories, and this is what you're going to learn today, those stories live within your own story as well. And to be cognizant or aware of or hold close within that that story matters too. All right. So let's just take a moment together this morning as we get going to both have two candles, if you will, and you can use the two that I have behind me to honor your own story, and yet to be willing to have the capacity to allow the story of another to be folded into your own. All right. So I'll take a couple of deep breaths and invite you to do the same. Settle into your chair or your sofa, or take a sip of coffee and take a deep breath. Maybe one more. And simply pause for a moment with gratitude to acknowledge the meandering, beautiful story that is your life and all that it brings to you and to the world in which we share, with all of its ups and downs, its joys and its challenges, the way it unfolds mysteriously each and every day. That is your story. And just to pause for a moment with gratitude for that gift that is unfolding in your experience of life. And then with a full heart for that great gift of life that is your own particular landscape on which you meander through this gift, simply be aware that there are other lights that shine, other stories unfolding, stories sung in languages foreign to your ears, stories unfolding in landscapes so different than your own, stories full of mystery and wonder and wisdom. And for a moment, allow the light of another's story to shine within your own. And feel for a moment what it might be like to tend to the vibrancy and the wonder of someone else's life unfolding even within your own. Maybe this is the amazing grace we all seek. All right. Amen to that. Well, thanks for going along, the ride on some of those centering moments. They're a centering moment for me as I get ready to kind of dive in this morning to this content, and hopefully they provide a centering moment for you as well. And if you go the whole journey with us, that's awesome. If you just go this far and take a moment to kind of acknowledge kind of this capacity to live your own life and also tend to the life of another, that's probably plenty to guide your day. But we've got more to come. Today is going to be a little bit different. I oftentimes spend a lot of time jumping around to different insights and narratives from different religions and philosophical points of view, life experiences, trying to weave them together into some sort of a wisdom moment that we can collectively share. And today I want to focus in on one particular story. It's a story in the way Mark unfolded his gospel. It's in Mark's gospel. You can look it up when we're done in chapter 5. So Mark chapter 5 is this story of Jairus, you're going to meet in a minute. And Jairus has a 12-year-old daughter who is on the verge of death. So that's the story we're going to explore today. But that story is interrupted by another story of someone else who has the number 12 associated with them, a woman who has no name, who has been struggling with a medical condition that she has sought healing for 12 years to no avail. Those are the two stories that are come together today. Now, before we get into the story, I want to frame it a little bit. And I'm going to be looking at my notes a little bit because I do want to do this justice. This is such a good story. It's like it's almost like if you only knew one gospel story, this could be it. It's as powerful, if not maybe even more powerful than the Easter story. In fact, it ends with kind of an Easter celebration at the end, which you're going to stumble into. Am I giving too much away? I'm not into numerology, but there are key numbers in the biblical narratives. You know them pretty well, right? 7 is a big one. That one pops up over and over again. It means completion. It's like wholeness. The third day is a trigger image that shows up over and over in Hebrew scriptures and in the New Testament story. 40 is another whopper. 49 happens to be another big one. And 12, which is the one that's used today, is also a whopper. The 12 is a symbol for the kind of tribal village life that the people of Israel constructed after they fled Egypt as a way to articulate their sense of holy community, right? So you have the 12 tribes of Israel, which is a way. 12 is this number that captures your imagination to say, this is what the beloved community looks like. And so when you hear the number 12, what you should be thinking of is this is a trigger number, a way to remind me that what we're really talking about is the beloved community. This sort of sacred commons that the people of Israel were trying to create as they fled dis-ease in Egypt and moved into wilderness, into wild space to reimagine what their life might be like. And it is the same thing in the gospel writer's narrative of the life of Jesus, excuse me, that he chooses 12 to capture that their movement too is trying to reimagine, reframe, recast what beloved community, sacred commons is all about. And so whenever we're dealing with the number 12, and in this story, there are two characters who embody that number. There is Jairus' daughter, who is 12 years old. The daughter of Jairus is the focus of this initial story. And she's the 12-year-old who is on the brink of death. So if you're paying attention, which you are because I'm telling you to pay attention, 12 is about the beloved community. What does it mean to bring the beloved community back to life when it might be on the verge of death? Which in our context, the life I'm living right now, sounds awfully familiar, right? What does it mean to bring the beloved community back to life? That's the story of Jairus. That's what the number 12 means. Okay, so that's important. The other thing that's important is that Jairus is going to represent what we might think of as the dominant narrative of the time, right? Jairus is a person of privilege inside of that narrative. It's the privileged narrative. And so when we begin the story, we begin in the world of privilege. Those who've kind of got it all together. And even in the world of privilege, there seems to be this question about can the beloved community survive inside this narrative of privilege? Again, it's just almost unnerving how close this story rivals the story you and I are in the middle of right now as a culture and a world, as a planet swirling in our cosmos, right? This is a great story for our time. It starts there, but inside, and I'm just telling you what's going to happen so you're paying attention when it does happen, right? Inside this story, it abruptly kind of comes to an end, and another story, it turns out there's another story inside of Jairus's dominant story. And that story is explodes on the scene based on an unknown woman, a woman with no voice, no name. And she is not a part of the dominant narrative, but is outside of that narrative. But what happens is her story is the only way forward for the Jairus story. The Jairus story, in seeking how does wholeness come to the loved community, cannot resolve without the story that's within the story. See, I told you it's complicated, and that's why I warned you in the little pre-Facebook live post that it was going to be complicated, and it all resolves ultimately with a resounding chorus of amazement when this story comes to an end. By the time we get to our 30 minutes together or 40 minutes together, when this story ends, that wave of amazement is the same language that Mark uses at the resurrection. As if to say, this story captures what the transformation into new life really looks like. And that's why, I'm just going to pause here, that's why it is not only an amazing literary tool within Mark's gospel that he uses, but it is, if you will, right up there in one of the most critical stories in Mark's gospel. It's pivotal. After the story's over, just so you know, there's this thing about, well, let's make sure everybody has enough to eat. That's why I've got the bread over here. The next big story is the feeding of the 5,000. It is the explosion of this mini narrative into a wider narrative. Yes, we're going to bring about healing, and then let's get everybody together in the commons and break bread. I mean, it's mind-blowing if you pay attention to where this sits inside the larger arc of Mark's storytelling. Do you see why I'm a little bit nervous about doing this? Because it's critical that I do this right? Why is this so important for our time? And then I want to get on with the story. You might, well, not might, I think you're probably figuring out that what the trick here is to say is, what is the story within the story in our place and time, right? Think about the insulating capacity of white privilege that many of us are kind of awakening to, and realize that the insulating power of white privilege that we're waking up to is being driven by a story that we haven't paid attention to for so long inside of that white privilege story about how Black lives actually really matter. And the long, silent cry, it feels like, of that story that is now breaking through into this story of white privilege. That to me is an absolute perfect example. And the example why this is so critical for our time is that our story, particularly as a white male, I can't resolve my story, find my way into what sacred community really looks like without the other story coming into my own. That's one example, right? You could also look at it at the noisy, powerful, consumptive story of the Industrial Revolution, and how that story too is like coming apart at the seams in many ways. And yet, if we can't resolve the story of the Silent Spring, the story of the voiceless ecosystem that we haven't been able to somehow allow to find its place within that larger narrative, that our big story about how we manage resources as modern people will not resolve until that other story finds its voice within our own. This is, in my opinion, a deeply wise material for our time. And the last one would be even, and I think this has happened and continues to happen, even the story about kind of binary ways of thinking about gender roles or sexual orientation, right? That was a dominant story that we thought we could orient our lives to, and yet it too began to break down as we saw the movement, the many shades of the pride flag, if you will, waving as that movement for a diversity of ways of thinking about sexual orientation or gender identity began to find its voice inside the dominant story. Only then could the dominant story begin to resolve itself and find its new voice, find its Easter morning voice. These stories are not like stories that we want to leave in history, but that we want to use to inform our own high story of the day. Okay? So that's why it's so critical to pay attention to this one. And you can go back to Mark chapter 5 and reread it if you want. All right? So let's do the story. I'm going to walk you through this, so try to pay attention. Go get another cup of coffee. I don't care what you have to do. Lean into the screen. I don't care what you have to do. But this is the story, so pay attention. This is the story of a 12-year-old. I use the number 12, remember? Think metaphorically. The 12-year-old, this beloved community, that wakes up. That wakes up because it had fallen asleep. And when it had fallen asleep, there was a presumption that it was dying. Can 12 wake up? Let's start the story. It begins with Jairus. Jairus is at the top of the heap. I mean, Jairus is the top of the heap. Jairus is a man's man in a man's world in a patriarchal system that was totally oriented that way. So Jairus is like on top of the world, big candle, shining bright in his world. He's also a leader in the synagogue, so he's part of the religious elite. So he not only has arrived, he's also got integrity. I mean, he's not just show. His soul runs deep into the narrative of the Hebrew story. So this is Jairus, and Jairus is got a 12-year-old daughter who is on the verge of death, and he wants that daughter to thrive, to be well, to be whole. And Jairus comes to Jesus as an equal and speaks eloquently, more eloquently than I can, speaks eloquently to Jesus with a dignified fashion, addressing him, laying out the challenge that's in front of him. And he's saying, look, my 12-year-old daughter, that's a big term, that's why I keep saying that so much. My 12-year-old is on the verge of death, and maybe only you can heal her. And in the story, Jesus, who hears the story, says, yeah, let's do this thing. Let's resolve this dis-ease. Let's get your 12-year-old back up and running again. And Jesus says, let's go. And so Jairus and Jesus head off to bring healing to the 12, the beloved community. As they begin to transition, something stops this story. And I'm going to change hats. Something changes this narrative at this point. Because in this kind of golden moment, a little shady, in this golden moment, Jesus is in the crowd, which is a technical term that that Mark uses over and over again, saying it's like the crowd represents like the mass of the human experience, right? So it's not the religious people, it's not the political people, it's just the masses. So the faceless masses. Out from the faceless masses, somebody who is unknown, unnamed, reaches out from the crowd and grabs a hold of Jesus' garment. And it turns out that the person who reaches out from the faceless crowd is a woman who has been suffering with dis-ease for 12 long years. She has sought resolution of her dis-ease quietly because she has no voice in society, right? She's a woman in a man's game. Excuse me. She sought healing to no avail. And all of the physicians that she's approached that have promised her healing have simply dangled the healing out in front of her as a potential freedom from dis-ease, only to rob her of her money and to line their own pockets. So that sounds familiar, doesn't it? So she has been given the promise of healing and wholeness, the promise of some sense of freedom to be able to live a full life, but has only been fleeced by that promise. In some ways, I think Jesus notes that's the real disease that's going on, but that's a whole story for another day. So she reaches out from the crowd, and because she has no voice, I don't know, you can tell this if you read the story in Mark's gospel in chapter 5, she can't talk to Jesus. She's only talking to herself. Her dialogue can only be an inner dialogue. It is not heard in the story. It's inside of her. She can't even get her voice out there. That matters, right? She reaches out with an unclean hand and grabs Jesus' garment. Now, in that day, if you were touched by somebody with disease, the disease would move from the person who was ill to you, and you too now would be diseased. So they saw that that illness or something like this would flow from that person into you, and now you would be diseased. But in this story, the movement flows the other way. Jesus feels the energy move out from him, and the woman is healed. And so there's this healing that takes place of the woman with no voice in the middle of the story, and Jesus pauses the entire narrative and he tells his disciples, "Who touched me? Who was that reached out from the unknown masses? Who reached out and touched me and received healing?" And what do the disciples say, right? They're like, "Hey, look, there's no way. It's just forget about it. It's the masses. It's this sea of storylines that we don't have the capacity to pay attention to, Jesus. So let's get to Jairus's house." Right? That's where the healing has to happen. So the disciples want to get Jesus off of this. It's not even a voice, right? It's an outreach that comes from the silent abyss of the nameless crowd. They want to move beyond that. They're like, we can't even hear that story, Jesus. So let's move on. And Jesus refuses. He says, "No, who was that?" And that's when the woman appears out of the crowd. Remember, she's 12, the woman of the 12 years of suffering, as if she too is a part of what it means to be in the sacred commons. The 12-year-old woman comes out, and Jesus, in that moment, sees her face and invites her into the space where Jairus was residing, right? So Jairus was in front of Jesus, asking, and now the woman is moved from the faceless crowd into the front of Jesus, and Jesus gives her a name. And this is a critical moment in the story. He says, daughter. Ooh, if you're hearing this story for the first time, you should get chills up your back. Daughter. This story started with Jairus' 12-year-old daughter, who is now that storyline seems to have come to an end. And there is a new daughter who is brought center in the story. Daughter elevates this nameless woman to the center of the story. And Jesus says, your faith or trust has made you whole. Her faith was not a religious faith. Her faith was this just longing that she might be healed, that she would not give up on the possibility that her story could matter. And that was her faith. That was her trust. That was her hope. And it was that trust, that faith, that she might be a part of the sacred commons, that she could have voice. That was her faith. And it was that faith that made her whole. Not the religious faith of Jairus, the faith of this nameless woman in the crowd. Wow. The story feels like it's resolving right there. But at that moment, it switches again. So here what happens. The healing of this woman takes place in the center of the story. We go back to the Jairus story. I'm changing hats just to keep you focused. We go back to the Jairus story. Jairus' servants come rushing in, and they say, hey, Jairus, bad news. Your daughter's died. It's too late. You guys were on your way, and then you stopped, and you invited in this other situation, and you took your eye off the ball, and the longing for bringing the beloved community to wholeness, or the 12-year-old daughter back to life, it's over. So, forget about it. Don't bother coming. And then you'll see, if you read the story, Jesus says, no, that daughter isn't dead. That daughter isn't dead. That daughter's asleep. Asleep. And if you look at Mark's gospel, every time you see people who are asleep, it's people who have sort of, got numb or checked out or lost their spirit for this whole movement. The disciples fall asleep in the garden when Jesus is trying to get ready to go, to Jerusalem and knows the trouble's coming. They fall asleep. They kind of check out. In some senses, Jesus is saying, if you fall asleep to the spirit of this movement, that falling asleep is actually death. And so Jesus goes back to Jairus' house, and he wakes this girl up. And as she wakes up, she is brought back to life again. The 12, gets woked. They use that term now. Wakes up and is brought back to life. And the story resolves, and Jesus says, rise up, little girl, and live. But that little girl can only rise up. The 12-year-old girl, the 12-year-old daughter, only gains her life because of the resolution of the story within the story. There's some pretty hearty wisdom in there. That the longing of Jairus for the beloved community could not find its resolve without the embrace of the story of brokenness that it's embedded inside of that massive, dominant narrative. And when that healing happens, only then can the daughter awaken. And when she awakens, Jesus says, now let's give her something to eat. And, and as she gets fed, in the next scene, Jesus is feeding the 5,000. Everybody is breaking bread, just like church communities continue to break bread on a Sunday morning. This sequence of narratives is, in some ways, the heartbeat of what gospel means, of what good news really means. And it's one of the reasons why Mark's story is not about elevating Jesus to some status of miracle worker or divine being, but of reimagining what the beloved community might look like, what real divine commons looks like. And if you ask me, if I look at the world in which we find ourselves, that's a story, for our time as well. I mean, if you think about what does it take for us to wake up to beloved community when we're living in the political world we're living in right now, in the world of healthcare as we face this pandemic, in the world of how we police the commons, right, in our time, in the world of incredible polarity manifested in cities around the world and experiences of people around the world and in our own country. In educate, I mean, I could go on and on. Education, the environmental movement. This feels like an invitation to explore what it might look like, to allow a story of healing that exists or is percolating or longing for resolution, that is often in underneath the dominant story. Until that can come to the surface, there is no good news for anybody, right? There is no hope unless we can bring those stories to life within all the stories we lead. That coming together of those stories seems like the point of this gospeling. And in some ways, and this is where I'm going to close, we hit 37 minutes. If you wonder, what does grace look like? What you just witnessed is the amazing power of grace, of love, kindness, compassion, sharing the gift of life. That's the amazing grace. That's the amazing grace that can save a wretched situation like the one we might find ourselves in as we journey through life. Wow. All right. That's an awesome story, isn't it? I mean, so you got a hot day in front of you. You could open up Mark chapter 5 and read it again. You could go back and revisit this little thing. You could watch it again. But I think the challenge I want to leave you with is to think about if you get a story going, which is your story, how do you, and everybody might do this a little differently, how do you change hats, right? And say, all right, let me invite in some other narrative and see how that changes, this story, my story. A perfect example is the invitation we have for 12 people. We didn't choose that number intentionally. 12 people to get around in a Zoom call that I'll put the link again in the Facebook feed to just have a conversation about how we can activate ourselves around the racial inequities in our society. That's a good one to experiment with this model, this gospel model. You could do that with the environmental movement. I think it's to me even more dominant challenge that we face, right? How am I going to give voice to the voiceless species who, literally are going extinct around me, or the agony of the ecosphere as we live our lives in relationship to it? That would be another one. I mean, you could find your issue and apply this kind of gospel model as an invitation to see, could that change the character of how you understand what it means to be in the divine commons, the collective that we are a part of, and what that really means for us. So that's the challenge, I think. Excuse me, must be the weather's messing with me. I think that's the challenge that we know we're in the middle of. We know we have to cope with it somehow. What might be a tool we can use to do that? And lo and behold, maybe there's some wisdom buried deep in a story that unfolded in a very similar time. Obviously, the stakes were different because the issues were different, but they found their way. Many of these people found their way into experimenting with the invitation of friend and stranger to table, so that many stories might become the one collective story we share. One table where we share bread equitably. One story where every light can shine. Sounds a bit like utopia, but given our context, isn't it worth trying to maybe learn how to do both? Gyrus. All right. Whew, enough for today. I'm going to invite you to listen to Martin's version of Amazing Grace, which is a perfect example of turning Amazing Grace kind of on its side a little bit and experiencing it that way. So listen to that tune. Obviously, invite you to explore this kind of way of being holy or intentional or focused or spiritual in our time, that is not just about your relationship to God and getting that figured out, like save my bacon, but your bacon saving is linked to another story, right? So play around with that, see what that does for you. Maybe do some journaling about it. I don't know. It's your faith life. You do the work. I'm trying to do my work. So that's the go ahead. On the announcement front, very, very excited that we just locked down our podcast series coming up this fall. We met with all of the podcast presenters, and that is coming up the week of the 20th. So I'm excited about that. You're going to get an invitation into another media source that you can use while you're in the car or on your walk or wherever, that's not kind of linked to the requirement of sitting down and watching me and paying attention to each other. But some really great wisdom from graduate theological students exploring faith and spirituality and ethics and environmentalism and all sorts of subjects for our time, from the wisdom that they bring as they have poured their heart and soul into that academic journey through the Graduate Theological Union. So some good stuff coming up on the horizon and more. So thanks for being a part of today. Stay cool if that's possible. As you know, we don't have air conditioning, so we've locked the place down, and we're going to just do our best to get through this day and hope for a little bit of cool on the other side. And then, of course, kind of, I have a heart for you, and I want you to know that there are many who long that you will find some grace and wonder no matter where you are in your unfolding story. And that doing it with a gospel flair is just an invitation to invite in maybe some other stories so that your world might awaken. As I said at the close of this story, the crowd was in amazement. And the language of that amazement was the language of Easter dawn. Whew, I hope a new day dawns for you and me and the world. Amen. All right. Peace, everybody.